Essential question 4 is, how did the market revolution affect the lives of workers, women, and African Americans? And in going over this, I'm going to use the order that the question presents because it asks about the lives of workers, women, and African Americans in that order, and then the text kind of goes about it in a somewhat different order. So this may take some rearranging of your notes that you have, but it's just going to be much easier in covering it. So first, for workers, during the market revolution, the U.S. develops a widening gap between wealthy merchants and industrialists and then poor workers. We're starting to see the development of a kind of blue-collar working class and then a white-collar upper class of industrialists. Now, there were some early, albeit unsuccessful, unionization efforts for better working conditions that came out of this emerging working class, but these movements aren't very large, and as I say, they're not very successful. But we're beginning to see the development of patterns of a widening gap between management, or sort of the owners of these businesses, and then the people they actually employ to work them. And that gap between the two is going to be incredibly important after the Civil War in various different social, economic, and political conflicts that we're going to see in the late 1800s. Second, women. For most women, work opportunities were still closed to them. Now, some did work in factories, such as the aforementioned Lowell girls, but most were still working in the house and were essential to household incomes through something called the putting out system, where merchants would ship raw materials into homes and women would work inside the home to manufacture those into finished goods, which they would then give back to the merchant, who would pay them a wage for their work. So although there were some job opportunities opening up in manufacturing for women, most were still working out of the home. And for women still, Republican motherhood, or the cult of domesticity, was the norm. And again, this idealized women's roles as wives and mothers, and said that women should be considered to be more naturally moral than men. And then it held that women should, of course, be held responsible for moralizing their families. So the standard view of women that was developed in the colonial period is still important in governing women's social roles in the early 1800s. Now, among the emerging middle class, women were not expected to work at all, and in fact, hiring servants to do the housework served as a kind of badge of respectability, having a maid, having a cook, those types of things. But still, women were relegated to lower social statuses. The man was considered to be the head of the household and in charge of the finances, and this becomes a standard that's very ingrained in middle class culture moving forward. And third, African Americans. And when we're talking about African Americans in this context, we're really referring to free African Americans, not slaves. We'll spend our own time looking at that population in later chapters. But for free African Americans, they faced discrimination and exclusion from jobs by nativists and by immigrants both. And not only did free African Americans face the kind of routine discrimination and racism that we're familiar with, but they also faced constant and ubiquitous racial characterization in pop culture. In fact, Irish immigrants tended to use racial caricatures in blackface minstrel shows. So these were like these stage shows where whites would dress up and paint themselves black to sort of impersonate these sort of black racial caricatures or black racial stereotypes. And there were a number of different characters. One that was very common was Jim Crow. And Jim Crow was portrayed as a carefree but childlike and stupid slave. And Jim Crow, of course, is going to be the name of the system of segregation that's developed in the South after the Civil War, and that name is because that minstrel show was so popular and that character was so well understood. Another character was called Zip Coon. Zip Coon was a character that was an irresponsible free African American who put on airs like trying to rise above his station. The third is Mr. Tambo, which played on the stereotype of African Americans as inherently musical. So all three of these characters were from these blackface minstrel shows that were put on typically by the Irish, who were trying to degrade African Americans as potential workers in the new industrial workforce. The Irish, who were treated as certainly foreigners, they were treated as a lesser race, were trying to distinguish themselves among their other lower class competitors, African Americans, by emphasizing their whiteness in opposition to the blackness of African Americans, hopefully for them, making them a group that industrialists would be more willing to hire. But finally, as African Americans were barred from schools and other public facilities throughout the country, they began to create their own institutions. And of those, churches would become especially important as central parts of free African American communities. And the centrality of the church to African American communities is going to be a trend that we will see continue on into the 20th century.